Hi, I'm Laura Cox Kaplan. Welcome to She Said, She Said. I created this platform a couple of years ago with the specific intent to showcase a broader range of women's voices, how we lead, and how we have a positive impact. I'd been frustrated for a long time that there was a very narrow view of what women's leadership really looked like. Since that time, after more than 100 episodes, I think have stayed true to that mission of presenting you with interesting voices of insightful perspective that is oftentimes very unique to women. We're in incredibly challenging times, to be sure. And I aim to be very sensitive with the topics that we cover, but also to stay true to that goal of giving you that insight, that food for thought, a positive uplift to your day. My guest today is no exception. In fact, I think she's the perfect complement to many of the topics that we oftentimes talk about. Emily Ramshaw is one of the most innovative female voices in media. She is the co-founder and CEO of The 19th. It is the nation's first nonprofit, nonpartisan newsroom that is situated squarely at the intersection of gender, politics, and policy. She and her team are working to create more inclusive coverage of issues as they pertain to women of all colors, all faiths, all political persuasions. It's a huge, huge challenge and very difficult to achieve and do it well. So I'm excited to have Emily here to talk about that. Beyond that, the 19th is also embracing a cutting-edge nonprofit journalism business model that is similar to one created at the Texas Tribune. Emily has spent the past decade at the Tribune as the editor-in-chief since 2016. When Texas Tribune co-editors Evan Smith and Ross Ramsey were asked how they selected Emily to join their team when they were just getting the Texas Tribune started, Ramsey is quoted as saying, "You ought to hire the reporters who you are afraid to compete with." And he, of course, was referring to Emily. She is a real journalist who understands how to dig into a story. She's gone undercover in a polygamous West Texas cult, exposed sexual abuse in juvenile detention centers, and her work as both a journalist and a leader in media earned her a seat on the Pulitzer board. We have so much to discuss in this conversation. Emily, welcome to She Said, She Said.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here with you.
I am delighted to have you. You're all the way from Austin, Texas, my old stomping ground. So it's great to be connected to you and back to my Texas roots.
Indeed. Well, we wish you were here with us. We wish you were anywhere with anybody else right now.
So. I know. I hear that. So let's start by talking about the 19th. This is a very exciting venture. And I want you to tell our viewers and our listeners what the 19th is, but I also want you to talk about why you felt the need to start something new. You were already at the Texas Tribune. You're in an editorial position. Why not double down on gender coverage at an existing publication as opposed to starting something new?
The long and short is, let me tell you a little bit about the 19th. So the 19th, which launches in August, is the country's first nonprofit, nonpartisan newsroom at the intersection of women, politics, and policy. And what that means for us really is storytelling that elevates the voices of women of color and women off of the coasts in American media, that really seeks both a demographically and ideologically diverse audience. And it is powered by storytelling that is not sort of the day's news, but pink. It is a journalism that exposes disparities, gaps, opportunities for women across virtually every arena, whether it's our healthcare system, our economy, our workforce, maybe most important, the role of women in representative government in the United States. And so the goal for me was to build this new platform. I'll take you back about 4 years ago. I had just had a baby girl. I was in an extraordinary job at the Texas Tribune. It really serves as a sustainable gold standard for nonprofit local news. Trump had just been inaugurated. We were seeing all these women's marches. The Me Too movement was really underway. And I just sort of stopped and thought, I feel like women don't have a home. They don't have a safe sort of journalistic space, a media platform where we can exchange ideas, where we can have civil discourse, where we can teach women, give them the tools and information they need to make the best decisions for them politically, from a policy standpoint. I thought, why don't we take this really sustainable business model for local news at the Texas Tribune and try to extrapolate it onto a national stage for women, politics, and policy? And so, it took me a few years to get beyond having a small infant spitting up on me to actually being able to see the light and consider building this new venture. But honestly, the lead up to 2020 felt like the absolute right time. So here we are.
Yeah. So give me an example of kind of how what the 19th will do will differ from what we might see at another publication.
Sure. I mean, I think the biggest difference is at many other publications, there's a particular vertical devoted to gender or to women. It's buried inside the broader publication. It's a side dish and not the main course. For us, that journalism is the main course. It's front and center. And I think another big difference is that a lot of news organizations talk at their audience. They tell the stories. They expect their audience to consume them. Our goal is to have a really robust conversation, a dialogue with our readership to provide news and information, but also an exchange of ideas. We'll do a lot of asking. We're going to do a lot of listening. And I think the primary other sort of big difference is for us, women of color and women off of the coast, women who find themselves historically underrepresented in American media are front and center. They are the story for us. So I think that's an area where we will differentiate ourselves.
It's such an interesting approach. So how about, as you think about your audience, you've just outlined your audience from the standpoint of how you think about it related to the different sort of segments and interests of women. But what about men who really benefit from these conversations? How do you think about men as part of your audience, or is it really just, is your audience focused on women?
No, we got to feed men their vegetables too.
Absolutely.
So we think about the distribution of our journalism in two primary ways. So yes, we are absolutely building our own digital platform, 19thnews.org, where we imagine we'll have a really robust community of primarily women who sort of identify as frontliners. They maybe care about one or more issues. They maybe already are either a little bit civically engaged or want to be more deeply civically engaged, and that's great. But we also are giving all of our journalism away for free to every other news organization in America. There will be an easy republish button on our website. We're brokering really incredible arrangements right now with major news gathering, news distribution companies around the country where they can automatically push our work out to their audiences. So our goal is to be in hundreds of daily newspapers around the country every day, to be distributed and republished in Spanish and pushed out across those platforms, to have relationships with ethnic media where our work is also powering and appearing in their platforms. The goal is that, the woman or man on the bus in El Paso between job 1 and job 2 picks up a discarded copy of the El Paso Times and sees our reporting. That's where I think the majority of men will find access to our work. Yes, we want to build a robust online audience, but our vision and our public service mission also is to get in front of as many eyeballs as possible, whether or not those folks come to our platforms. And so that's where men fit into this equation. We need them.
No, that's really, really helpful. You have touched on a couple of times the business model and the uniqueness of this. And I think this is such an interesting time for journalism where traditional publications are really feeling the squeeze for a host of reasons. And that's part of what makes what was created at the Tribune that you have been a part of for the last decade so unique. And you've sort of taken, it sounds like, a version of that to create the 19th. Talk a little bit more in depth about the nuts and bolts of the business model itself, which I find fascinating.
Sure. So, I think what we championed at the Texas Tribune and what was so innovative there was a really entrepreneurial nonprofit. So it's a 501c3, but it has a super diversified set of revenue streams. And that's what we're trying to extrapolate to the 19th. And so those revenue streams are philanthropy, which is always a piece of the equation for a nonprofit like the 19th. Foundation support. We want those supporters, those big foundations at the table. But there's also corporate revenue, corporate underwriting, which tends to be sort of the corporate social responsibility budgets of companies. It's, Anheuser-Busch talking about the water they, gave away during Hurricane Harvey versus selling beer. So corporate underwriting is certainly a piece of this pie. Membership is an important piece. Membership is not sort of the pay to play, it's not subscription based, but it is the public radio viewers like you model. In the first 24 hours after we announced that we were launching the 19th in January, we raised $100,000, most of it in individual $19 gifts from women around the country.
Wow.
So we sort of the sky could be the limit there from that standpoint. And then finally, and this is the biggest question mark in this moment, is live events. The Texas Tribune really championed live events where you brought Texans into direct conversation with their elected officials around the state. We are hoping to do that with the 19th with elected officials around the country. So far, we have pivoted from those, in-person events to virtual. The corporate underwriting for those virtual events has conveyed, which we think is really promising. But I do think sort of long-term, that's the big question mark as we wait and see when folks are comfortable being together in the flesh, which I think is an incredibly important way for women in particular to dialogue and to exchange ideas.
So it sounds like there's a real doubling down too as part of this as it relates to kind of what we would refer to in another context as a direct-to-consumer model, where whether you're selling widgets or shoes or whatever, that especially in this environment, there is a real need to connect more closely with your consumer and to get that feedback, right? Talk about how that piece of the puzzle, maybe dig a little bit deeper into how you maintain that connection. You talked about live events, which is an interesting piece of that, but I know there's more. Talk a little bit more about how that works.
Yeah, community is so important to journalism. And I think in many ways, it's what we lost in this business over the last couple of decades, these relationships with your audience, where they're, it has become sort of a dirty word, but the reality is we need them and they need us. And it should be a sort of, sometimes it's going to be a rocky relationship, but it should be a trusting relationship. And I think building trust in media, we found at the Texas Tribune that even if folks disagreed with your coverage, they trusted you more if they met you in the flesh and they knew who the reporter was who was telling those stories. And they, came to your events and saw you in the room. It wasn't just sort of, the echo chamber of people shouting each other down on Twitter. And one interesting way we're already seeing this at play at the 19th is we started pushing out a newsletter. We weren't intending to have a newsletter really until our launch in August, but around the time that COVID set in, we felt like we had an obligation to start telling stories, even via newsletter, about the ways that women were being disproportionately affected, whether it was the way they were losing jobs at a faster rate, or the fact that they were 3/4 of frontline healthcare workers who were being sickened by COVID. And so we started this sort of organic newsletter that now has about 10,000 people reading it several times a week, with a ridiculously high open rate of like 45%, which is crazy for a newsletter. It's great. And what's happening over and over again that still stuns me as an editor and a journalist is the number of people who literally just hit reply to those emails, those newsletters, and write us their personal stories and talk to us about what they're grappling with, trying to homeschool 3 kids while hanging on to a job while their husband has headphones on in the office, focusing on, his place of employment. It's been a fascinating, women are hungry for this dialogue and communication, and the fact that they'll respond to, an email newsletter with a personal story, seeking out that, firsthand connection, to me is really reassuring that we're onto something here.
I'm curious about your analytics as you dig into them and look at them. Are you finding that you're getting the same level of response across the spectrum of the women that you're trying to serve, from women of color to more conservative women than you typically hear from, to other women that might be, more inclined to write to you or to speak up or things like that? Talk about what you're seeing in terms of the range of input that you're getting. And is it truly diverse? Is the audience response as diverse as what you're hoping?
Sure. It's sort of hard to know right now because we don't have analytics per se on the racial or, political, ideological backgrounds of the folks. You tend to hear from people, I think in the early days, we're hearing from women who are hyper engaged on either sides of the aisle. I think the The trickier piece for us right now is trying to determine, I think the two hardest groups to reach, and these are, I use the term groups lightly because these are whole groups, these are enormous subsets of our population.
Of course.
But we are really aggressively seeking women of color who we think are underserved and underrepresented by legacy media. We're also really trying to reach conservative women who I think many of whom see themselves as a caricature of themselves in a lot of legacy media and are looking for a place where they feel accurately reflected. I think, what we're trying to go for is nuance and storytelling that is empathetic and that reaches women where they are, where they see themselves reflected. And I find that even the language that we use is really interesting. Like when I don't believe that equity is a partisan issue. I don't believe that equity is a dirty word, but I find that, when you talk to women who identify as progressive, equity is a word that they really rally around. When you talk to women who are conservative, opportunity is a word that really resonates with them. And I think we're talking about the same things here, but that we're often talking past each other. And so we're trying to find a safe space where we can exchange these ideas and sort of get out of our own echo chambers and really talk to each other, with each other, instead of talking at each other or through each other. But it's like, this is an experiment, right? I mean, I think the reason that a lot of media has struggled to sort of scratch this itch is that it's really complicated. I just really believe we don't move the needle for true equality for women if the same groups of women are talking to the same groups of women all the time. So that's what we're trying to combat.
It is such a laudable goal, and what you said is so incredibly important as it relates to representation. There's, you see oftentimes people throw this terminology around and it's about all women, but it's not about all women. It's about certain segments of women. And so it's very refreshing to hear you talk about this. And while I recognize that you haven't officially launched, you said you'll be launching in August of this year. So it is a bit of a precursor, but you are beginning to cover issues. You have the newsletter out. And I know you've put a particular focus on coverage of women of color as, really trying to be on the leading edge of that. And I think it's important, especially in the current environment, because we are having this very challenging conversation. Everyone's grappling with what does this mean and how do we respond and how do we deal with this? Talk to me a little bit about maybe differences in the way that you're approaching this topic of women of color right now.
Sure. I mean, I'll start by saying I know what I don't know in this circumstance, which is like I'm a white woman of privilege. The people whose voices we are seeking to elevate have lived experiences, life experiences that bear next to no resemblance to mine, and I am super cognizant of that fact. I am devoted to building a sustainable platform where we can hire extraordinary women, particularly women of color, and elevate their voices and their storytelling and their communities so that our journalism, our media is more reflective of women than it has ever been. I mean, I think it's really important to note that women are not monolithic, that our lived experiences differ dramatically. And also that there has been unequal representation or reflection of the experiences of women of color in American media effectively since the founding of this nation. So we're feeling really, really cognizant of that. We're trying to keep our eyes really open. Our journalism is rooted in fact and evidence, and I think that's critically important. But we also have women on our team. Erin Haynes on our team came to us from the Associated Press, a Black woman who was covering race in the United States for the AP before she came over to cover sort of intersection of gender and race for the 19th. We're being cognizant of the fact that our reporters are experiencing really difficult things in this moment, feeling the sort of realities of their lives and the trauma and the legacies of their experience as they try to tell these stories. So for us, an example of a way that we might have approached this that's different than another news organization the incident in Central Park a couple of weeks ago that was sort of now in many ways feels lost in the George Floyd murder and the conversations we're having around that. A version of the 19th story was
just to bring our viewers up to
Yes.
speed. You're referring to the woman walking her dog in Central Park who called the police. She was approached by an African-American man and she called the police, correct?
Right. Exactly. Yes. They're both have the last name Cooper, so it's confusing. But the Central Park case, what we wrote about, what Aaron wrote about, was the power that white women still hold over Black men. That is really a legacy of that dates back to slavery and the accusations that white women could make against Black men, and how their word was always taken at face value. I mean, I think these are important stories to tell about white women's privilege in this moment. And also there's a story to tell about the reckoning that I think a lot of women in this country on both sides of the aisle are going through right now, and thinking about what our responsibility or our obligation is. My white mom, who's in her 70s in Florida, sent me a text message last night asking if I could put aside, the Ta-Nehisi Coates books that I have for her when she gets back to Austin. And to me, that's a sign, I hope, that we're in the midst of a true sea change here, instead of yet another unnecessary death that doesn't result in sort of true societal change. So yeah. Tough stuff, obviously, but I think important for us to be talking about.
You're also, as we talked about just a couple of minutes ago, also trying to be very inclusive of different ideologies and political views, and really trying to embrace women on the right who oftentimes feel very left out of mainstream coverage and or either consciously or unconsciously ignored. Talk about how you will try to include them and what your newsroom will look like to be perhaps a bit more mindful. You talked about language differences and how people hear things differently. You may mean the same thing with the word, but you're going to hear it differently if you're coming from the left or coming from the right. So talk a little bit about how you're going to approach conservative women and try to engage and embrace them as well.
So for us, we're thinking a lot about regional diversity in addition to, racial diversity. When you see us building our newsroom over the next 2 months, you're going to see hires that are in a lot of unexpected places. We hired an economics reporter who was not based on Wall Street. She's based in Orlando, Florida. Cuban-American woman who we're super excited to bring into the fold, has been covering labor in Florida. You'll see us hiring reporters in Iowa City. You'll see us hiring, obviously, the base of our team is in Texas, in the heart of Texas. We're having conversations with extraordinary candidates who are everywhere from Atlanta to Sacramento to, Reno to Pittsburgh. I think that regional diversity is sort of begetting what folks in legacy media have sort of disparagingly called flyover country. We think flyover country should be the heart of the story. And so I think that's where you're going to see a lot of our hiring and where we hope that outreach begins. Empathy is really important to me. Understanding, really trying to make an effort to understand, why women believe what they believe, what their upbringings look like, what guides their decision making. It's not enough to stop into a diner in Iowa in your political coverage and think that you really understand the way that conservative women think. So I think that, empathy, I think a representative, reflective newsroom, making sure that we have leadership with a wide range of backgrounds. And then finally, the events piece of this is critically important. And we found this at the Texas Tribune as well. Whether it's virtual or in person, I think having conversations with, key conservative newsmakers, we're having a virtual launch event in August, and one of those key conversations is about the next generation of the GOP for women, the women who are trying to sort of change the face of the party for future generations. I think being inclusive in our dialogue, in our conversations, and in our storytelling is the way to start.
Yeah. So you talk about the fact that in some respects, this will be a virtual newsroom out of necessity. And one of the big challenges with this whole virtual environment, even though everyone's had to embrace this in a way that maybe they never thought that they could or would, given the experience with COVID over the last 4 months, How do you think about both creating, because this is a new organization, and managing that culture, creating the culture that you want, and then managing to that when, in effect, you are going to be operating virtually with or without COVID?
Yes. So consider this. When we launch in August, 80% of our staff I will have never met in the flesh.
No
Which is
way.
just like nuts. We're doing everything like this right now, including making, really critical decisions about the journalists in our operation. So I would say, for starters, that's just a totally new world order here. From the standpoint of managing teams, we are doing our absolute best to just make sure we're taking care of each other as best we can in this moment. This is different than being able to, you see someone kind of looking down in your office and you ask them how they're feeling, and that spurs a conversation about what's going on at home. That's a lot harder to do in this setting. We are insisting on a lot of FaceTime, whether you're in your pajamas or your yoga pants, or your cat is on your lap, or your kid is smearing something on you behind you, because we think it's really important to be able to, sort of take care of each other virtually. We're having a lot of Zoom happy hours where the only thing you can't talk about is work, where we're trying to sort of acquire the sort of life experiences or inside jokes, or the kind of things that you acquire in a office setting that we just can't do right now. One thing that's been fascinating about this moment is that the other big reason we launched the 19th was to prove the case that you could provide greater flexibility for women in newsrooms and help them to advance in their careers. So that meant for us things like, 6 months of fully paid family leave, 4 months of fully paid caregiver leave, so you could spend the last few months of your mom or dad's life with them without worrying that you had to be back at work. Something that was novel until a couple of months ago, like fully remote workspaces, where you could work wherever you have the best caregiver or childcare situation. That was an experiment. And we never once imagined or budgeted for the concept that everybody on our team would effectively need that flexibility at the same time, right? Like in a normal newsroom, one woman might be pregnant one year, a guy might be, adopting a child another year. It never all happens at once. Right. And we are now suddenly living out this reality where everyone needs that flexibility at the same time. And magically, it all still works. We're still launching on schedule a brand new startup with a whole bunch of women, moms who are navigating homeschooling their kids and launching a startup, trying to keep their elderly parents from going to the grocery store without a mask on and launching a startup. And I just think this is the honest to God hardest time to possibly imagine putting those kinds of opportunities in place for women. And we're proving the case that it still works, which should be a great signal to anybody else considering that kind of flexibility for their workforce.
I mean, it's actually a fabulous story. And I think if there is a silver lining to all of this COVID, it is the fact that so many, not all organizations for sure, there are plenty of people that are horribly affected, and the economy's taken a terrible hit, and there's awful stuff that has happened as a result. But there's also a lot of positive from the standpoint that people have figured out creative ways to do things in many respects, which is a really positive thing and a silver lining. Your career has taken several interesting turns, and so I'd love to dig into that a little bit. You started out as a journalist, you became an editor and made that shift. Now you are the CEO and the co-founder of an organization. Talk to me about, first of all, the shift, making the shift from journalist to editor, and what skills you needed that maybe you didn't have. How did you sort of close the learning curve gap? It's not that unusual for a journalist to become an editor, obviously, but what did you find you needed to do maybe more of that you hadn't realized before when you were a journalist?
Sure. I mean, I think so for anybody who makes the pivot from working journalist, working reporter to editor, I think the first thing you have to come to terms with is the loss of your own byline and sort of the ego boost and confidence that is associated with seeing your name in print or on the website or on the air, routinely. And I think there is sort of a little bit, you feel like maybe you're losing your journalistic soul for a hot second as you make that pivot. But what generally happens really quickly, and happened for me for sure, was this sort of, I was ignited by the joy I got seeing the reporters who I edited succeed and helping guide their coverage and helping them figure out what records to ask for and how to frame that story in the way that got, the biggest bang. And so I think that's an evolution. The other big evolution for me, obviously, was going from being the editor and leading a news operation, a daily news operation, to being a CEO, which suddenly you are literally responsible for the financial sustainability of yourself and of the people who you have sort of begged and pleaded to come with you on this mission. And it's an enormous responsibility. I'm a first-time CEO. I'm a first-time fundraiser. I thought I knew what I was doing, and then COVID struck. I'm relatively risk averse for a startup person. I'd like to have a couple of years of runway in the bank, no matter what.
Right.
I think this is putting all of the skills that I hoped I had to the test. So from that standpoint, it's an enormous career pivot. But I also feel like there aren't enough women who see themselves as news entrepreneurs or who have the gumption and guts to take that leap and see if they rise or fall. And I think in this moment where news organizations are struggling mightily to stay afloat and to keep their teams employed, we need more creativity, more flexibility, and more people willing to jump into that fray and try something new. And I'm honored to be one of those people.
Yeah. You mentioned the fact that you're risk averse, which I find a bit curious given the particular risks that you've taken in your career, including this most recent one, the risk from going from you were at the Dallas Morning News and you took a position at the Texas Tribune when it was a startup. So that was obviously a risk. And then you went from there to the editorial side, which is, to some degree, there's risk involved in that. But this latest pivot where you're literally starting a startup yourself and you're taking on wearing the hat of founder and CEO is yet another risk. Talk to me and talk to our listeners and viewers about how you think about risks. How do you know when the right time to make that move is?
It's interesting because leaving the Dallas Morning News to start the Texas Tribune did not feel like a risk. In fact, it felt riskier to stay in a newsroom where I had survived 4 rounds of layoffs in my first 6 years on the job. To me, at that moment, I didn't have a kid. I wasn't married. It felt like, this was a Hail Mary pass, honestly, for the industry, for local news. And it was the gift of a career. It changed, the entire course of my career. It made what I'm doing today possible, feasible. Was also surrounded by extraordinary allies, including our CEO at the Tribune, Evan Smith, who gave me every opportunity and knew that I could do it. So this latest risk is definitely a bigger risk. I have a small child. I'm married. I'm the provider of health insurance and benefits for our family. All of those things make this moment, I think, more pivotal. But for me, at the end of the day, I knew it was time to take the risk when I just could not get the idea out of my head. And I knew I would be really disappointed if somebody else did it and I hadn't. So yes, it's a risk, but I think for me, the greater risk is always standing still.
It's a great response and a great way to think about it. You are the daughter of two DC-based reporters. So you grew up in the Washington metro area and moved to Texas. It's fairly unusual to have somebody who decides to cover politics and pursue journalism coming from DC and going to Texas. Talk a little bit about why you made that particular decision. How did that come about?
Sure. So I never thought I would stay in Texas. I am a child of DC. My parents were both political journalists there. And Texas was the first place I got a journalism job. So I came down to work for the Dallas Morning News. They sent me down to Austin to cover the legislature. And when I got to Austin, I realized that I had sort of found my personal mecca. It's a very progressive city, and my job was covering one of the most conservative legislatures in the country. And that crux, that intersection, I found fascinating. I felt challenged every day. I felt like my own sort of preconceived notions shifted. I understand, and I learned very quickly that, there are really extraordinary, great, well-intentioned, and thoughtful people on both sides of the aisle, and that really terrific policy can be made when those challenging conversations occur. And so I fell in love with Texas in many ways. I fell in love with my husband, who is not a Texan. We're both from the East Coast. I sort of thought and hoped my career pivot early on. I sort of assumed I would start in Texas, and then I'd go to the Washington Post or the New York Times, and that would be my progression. But when I got here, and especially when we started the Tribune, I realized that this was where my heart was, and that this is where I wanted to stay and raise my family. And so now I'm in this moment of, I want to prove the case that you can build a national media brand from the center of the United States, partially because I don't want to leave Austin or Texas, but partially because I think in this moment in history, it's really important to prove the case that so much happens off of the coasts, and that we really need a truly representative, reflective media, and that starts with building brands that aren't in New York or DC or San Francisco or LA.
So we talked a minute ago about risk-taking. A somewhat related topic is the topic of self-doubt, which we talk about on this podcast a lot, and imposter syndrome. How do you get comfortable when you don't have all the answers, which you never should, right? You should always be learning and growing, but at the same time, it can present that real discomfort for a person. So for you, do you feel that self-doubt? And if you do, what's in your toolkit? What advice do you give for other people for kind of keeping that self-doubt at bay?
Yes, it's funny. There's only one person I've ever heard say they have no self-doubt. I was on a panel with Kara Swisher, and somebody asked that self-doubt question, and she was like, yeah, I just don't have self-doubt. And I was so impressed, because I am racked with self-doubt. It crops up all the time. I have it sitting here having a conversation with you. I have it as a journalist, as an entrepreneur. I have it as a mother, as a parent. I have it as a wife. I have it as a child. I'm never sure I'm doing the right thing. And I think that, honestly, it's healthy for me, that sort of level of always questioning, because it means I listen a lot. And I may be the boss, I may be the CEO, but I'm not the expert. And I try to surround myself with people who have the skills that I don't, who have the lived experiences I don't, and who can be a check on any of my ideas that are too far afield or that aren't appropriately inclusive. So I certainly don't have all the answers for this. And I do think as women, unfortunately, we are disproportionately plagued by this challenge of self-doubt. I know, count thousands of men who appear to have no self-doubt in these types of moments. But I think that self-doubt is really important, because it gives me the opportunity to step back and learn from others. So I think if you are a heavy self-doubter like I am, surround yourself with competent and extraordinary people.
But what you just described, it strikes me, you just described humility in a really beautiful and articulate way. I sort of think about self-doubt as being that voice inside your head that causes you to really second guess yourself. But you described humility, which is about, listening and recognizing what you don't know. So do you ever have those times when you get into that struggle with the person in your head and it's hard to say, no, this is absolutely what we need to do? Like, that's more, I think, what I'm kind of getting at, that I think a lot of people, women in particular, I think this can be a real challenge for us in a way that oftentimes men, or Kara Swisher apparently, don't necessarily struggle with.
Yeah, I think I have it from 3 to 5 a.m., right? I think that's the time of day when I wake up and all of those sort of creeping doubts, and did I do the wrong thing? And am I doing the right thing? Should I have made this change? All of those things sort of creep out of my psyche and take hold. So how do I balance them or battle them? I think I do it by staying extraordinarily busy. Like, honestly, I'm compulsive. I work nonstop, and that's not a great thing for somebody who's trying to build an organization rooted in balance. But for me, the best way to defeat those doubts is action, to forge ahead, to put the blinders on, And so I think that's when those doubts become all-encompassing, overpowering. That's when I really put the blinders on. I get out of bed, I go to the laptop, I start making those fundraising emails, I start making those invites to get big names at our events. I work my tail off to stay active and in the moment, and I find that that's a pretty good antidote.
Yeah. You're also a mom. You've mentioned your 4-year-old daughter, Sophie, a couple of times in this conversation. How did having Sophie change you? I mean, I know you're 24/7, but you're also very well known and very well regarded by the women around you for being somebody who manages to achieve, whether balance is the right word or not, who knows, prioritization, let's say, right? Talk about your sort of how being a mom has changed you and helped you evolve.
I mean, she's the best thing that ever happened to me. And that sounds cliche, but I struggled really mightily after she was born. I had pretty bad postpartum depression. I desperately wanted to go back to work. I, doubted myself both as a mother, but also as a professional in that moment. And so I went back to work very early. And my daughter revolted by refusing to take a bottle. And so we had to rent a parking space for her and hire a babysitter who brought her to me 3 times a day in this office full of, young people to nurse 3 times a day at this office. I had a curtain up, but there were people coming in and out for meetings. There was, breast milk all over the refrigerator at the Texas Tribune. It was like this crazy, there was constantly a howling baby in the midst of all of these people at this news organization. And she taught me that I wasn't in control, which was probably the most important lesson for someone who is as type A as I am. It was the first time in my life I really wasn't in charge of my own destiny or of my own schedule. And I think those lessons made me a much more empathetic manager. They taught me how to take care of my team. They taught me what flexibility really needed to look like for women in the workplace, and for men in the workplace, by the way. Like, honestly, it starts there. Encouraging men to take the same kind of leave policies that women take is so much better for equity in your marriage and in parenting. And so she changed everything for me. She taught me how to turn off Twitter. She taught me how to put down my phone. These sound like such simple things, but for journalists, we're hardwired to be constantly scrolling. She's just a beautiful and brilliant breath of fresh air who has changed how I think about my priorities in my life. And maybe most important, what I want this world to look like for women, in particular for women who look nothing like my daughter and who have not been born into the privilege that she's been born into. So she's changed everything, and she's the best.
That's amazing. That's really amazing. If you could just maybe expand on that a little bit and talk about what impact you hope to have as a journalist and as a leader starting this new organization. What do you hope that impact will be?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think obviously the big picture impact is I want journalism to be more inclusive, and I want journalism, American media writ large, to reflect more accurately the stories and experiences and opportunities of women in America. But I want to start by changing what the news industry looks like for women. And so, I want to make our benefits the gold standard, but also, the going rate in newsrooms around the country. I want more women in news leadership. I want more women news entrepreneurs. And for me, all of that starts with providing the opportunities and the flexibility for women to both navigate their families and navigate their professional lives. We posted 17 jobs at the 19th several weeks ago, and we got close to 1,000 applicants for those jobs. Almost all of them were women, and I would say close to 3/4 of those women were freelance. They had left the news business in their 30s and 40s because they just could not find the balance between, having their butt in the chair from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. as an editor and trying to be home for dinner and homework with their small children. I knew this was a problem. I didn't know it was this big of a problem or would be as obvious in the recruitment process as we've seen it to be. So I think that's the start for me is trying to change the game of this industry, which is exceedingly grueling and taxing. I mean, if you look at these, women reporters who've been covering the White House for the last 4 years and longer, the election before that, these people have not had a break in literally like 5 years. I look at people like Maggie Haberman who have, multiple children under 10, and I just do not know how she does it. She's superhuman. It's amazing. So yeah, those are the kinds of things I'm thinking about in a really big way in this moment.
So Emily, last question. We ask everyone who comes on this podcast for a single piece of advice, a life hack, or maybe a mantra. It could be something that you wish you had known when you were just starting out. What would yours be?
Mine is always something that my mom told me when I was negotiating my first salary. And that was the worst thing they can say is no, which, I was trying to decide how to ask for more money, and I was ashamed and I was afraid, and I didn't want to seem so forward. And I was afraid they might give somebody else the job if I asked for too much money. She said, Emily, the worst thing they can say is no, nothing worse than that. And she was so right. And I think about that in so many of my exchanges, whether it's advocating for myself as a woman in my professional life, whether it's thinking about the sort of social obligations that might keep me from my child. I think about it in virtually every aspect of my life. And I think I think about it all the time. It's the best advice I can give. The worst thing they can say is no. Always ask.
You're terrific. It was so great to be with you today.
Thank you for having me. This was great fun. I'm glad we were able to make it happen.
To learn more about Emily Ramshaw, check out the show notes for this episode. As always, I'm so grateful that you've chosen to spend some time with us, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.